Welcome, everyone, to Trad Answers. I'm John Salza with my colleague Robert Cisco. And today's episode, we're going to be talking about infallibility. Rob, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's been a while.
It has been. We've tried to record this for the last several months, and something kept coming up. Been busy.
But this is a really important episode. I think infallibility, there's so much confusion among Catholics and non-Catholics about this question of infallibility. I would say that this has led to many errors. And in fact, errors on this question have actually led souls out of the church. We hear this from Sedevacantists, from the Orthodox schismatics. And it's not just in schismatic and rad-trad circles. I would say even the neoconservatives err on infallibility. And the way, Rob, I would describe it as I see it as two extremes. You have the error on the left and then the error on the extreme right. So I would say the error on the left is where people are limiting the assent of faith to infallible teachings, and then they limit infallibility just to ex cathedra pronouncements, right? That's the only thing that can be infallible. And then they falsely claim, well, there are only two ex cathedra pronouncements, and that's also false. But the point is, these folks say if there's not a solemn judgment on something, for example, contraception or homosexuality, something like that, then they believe they're free to dissent, right? So I would call that an error of defect. But then there's the extreme right, and we've been dealing with a lot of this the past 10 years, where there's really the error of excess, where people are extending infallibility beyond its parameters as defined by the church. And then that leads them to either conclude that the post-Vatican II church has defected because its modern teachings, which they think are infallible, allegedly contradict prior infallible teachings, or they conclude that everything that's non-definitive, even novelties, right, things that were not taught in the past, like the admissibility of the death penalty or the claim that Muslims worship the same God as Christians, things like that, they automatically assume that all that must be accepted, if not infallible, at least with religious assent. And we're going to speak to that because that is not true. And you see this a lot with non-Catholics, with Sedevacantists, with the Orthodox schismatics, where they will claim that Vatican II contradicted prior dogmatic teaching. And one example that you and I just found recently is by Louie Verrecchio, who extends papal infallibility in a way that's entirely absurd. And what I'm referring to, Rob, you had uncovered an article that Louis wrote about Pope Leo the 14th, where he had made a statement to Eastern Orthodox pilgrims, that were gathered. I think they were from sees of Constantinople and Jerusalem, and there might be some other ones. But he made a statement to the effect of not being called to vie for the primacy. It was probably some type of conciliatory statement. The purpose of gathering was not to debate our theological differences, right, but to gather with some type of unity. Say what you want, but Louis took that and ran. He wrote an article, really extended infallibility to
that statement, as if infallibility should protect that statement from error, as if it was even an error. What Leo XIV said is Rome, Constantinople, and all the other sees are not called to vie for primacy. Louis thinks that infallibility should have covered that statement. He further thinks that if Leo XIV somehow was intended to deny the primacy, that would prove that the conciliar church is no longer the Catholic Church. He thinks infallibility extends to anything a pope says.
I know
pilgrim. It's unbelievable.
It's so absurd. And because the primacy, right, is a revealed truth, it's dogmatic. And because in Louis's mind, the Pope appeared to contradict it, he concludes that the Pope violated infallibility and therefore he can't be Pope. Okay, here's the error, and we can get into this in as much detail as you want, but here's the error for Mr. Louie Verrecchio. The Pope is not infallible if he's not defining doctrine, period. Did you get that, Louis? Yes. The Pope is not infallible if he's not defining doctrine. Yep. And then what I read in the article, Rob, that you showed me, he embarrassingly uses a Catholic encyclopedia reference, which is about the church and secondary objects of infallibility, which don't even apply. And they certainly don't apply to informal, offhanded statements a pope might make to an audience of pilgrims. So
Louis does not understand what he's reading. Louis doesn't understand any of the basics of infallibility. He just patches things together. It's like a Jehovah's Witness with the Bible, taking a Bible verse over here, a Bible verse over there, patching them together, not having any clue what they mean. This is the quote that Louis gives from the Catholic Encyclopedia. Quote, it says, as the divinely appointed teacher of revealed truth, the church is infallible. This gift of inerrancy is guaranteed to it by the words of Christ. The church, therefore, is infallible in matters both of faith and morals. Moreover, theologians agree that the gift of infallibility in regard to the deposit must, by necessary consequence, carry with it infallibility as to certain matters intimately related to the faith. Let's notice this next part. There are questions bearing so nearly on the preservation of faith that, could the church err at these, her infallibility would not suffice to guard the flock from false doctrines. That last sentence is referring to secondary objects of infallibility. Right. Louis thinks that's referring to whatever a pope says. He doesn't understand there's primary objects and secondary objects. Matter of fact, to prove that this is referring to secondary objects, let's go to the Catholic Encyclopedia article where this quote came from and see what the very next sentence says. Let me pull that up real quick. All right.
And this is so extreme, Rob, because this isn't a case of, an Orthodox apologist extending infallibility to non-infallible teaching, something that actually has been officially promulgated by the magisterium. Right. This is a guy that's trying to nitpick something that the Pope makes in an offhanded remark to an audience.
Yep. Yeah. In the very next sentence from the Catholic Encyclopedia article Louis quoted says this: such, for instance, is the decisions whether a given book does or does not contain teachings condemned as heretical. See dogmatic facts. Dogmatic facts are secondary objects of infallibility. That's what that's referring to. It's not referring to non-definitive teachings of a pope. Secondary objects are non-revealed teachings that the church, the pope or church can define infallibly. When it defines, it can define them infallibly. It's not non-definitive teachings. Let me read what the same Catholic Encyclopedia says about secondary objects of infallibility to further explain what that is. Go to the church's teaching on infallibility. It's not an encyclopedia. And we read this: the scope and object of infallibility. This means what the church is able to define infallibly. It can't define what the weather's going to be the next day, but it can define revealed truth and related truths. This is what it says, quote, in the Vatican definition, infallibility, whether of the church at large or the pope, meaning the entire college or the pope, is affirmed only in regard to doctrine of faith or morals. But within the province of faith and morals, its scope is not limited to doctrines that have been formally revealed. This, however, is clearly understood to be what theologians call the direct and primary object of infallibility authority. It was for the maintenance and interpretation and legitimate development of Christ's teaching that the church was endowed with this charism. But if this primary function is to be adequately and effectively discharged, it is clear there must also be indirect and secondary objects to which infallibility extends, namely doctrines and facts, which, although they cannot strictly be said to be revealed, are nevertheless so intimately connected with the revealed truths that, were one free to deny the former, he would logically deny the latter and thus defeat the primary purpose for which infallibility was promised by Christ to his church. So there's the primary and secondary objects. But again, these have to be defined by the church or taught definitively by the church to be themselves infallible. But Louis thinks that the reference that's referring to secondary objects is actually referring to whatever a pope has to say, and not even non-definitive teachings. That's his error. And so he concludes this by concluding that the so-called conciliar church is not the Catholic Church, because he thinks Pope Leo said something wrong to a group of pilgrims. Right. That's the absurdity of these sedevacanist heretics. They know nothing, especially the post-Francis sedevacanist heretics like Louis. Yes. The only ones knew a little more. I'm sure, I can hope that someone like Mario Dirksen will be embarrassed by this article, but I'm hoping that he understands.
I would think somebody like John Daly wouldn't have.
He would have
included this. I mean, there's no way. But it's not even, Rob, the Pope's offhanded statement. I mean, it's not even a doctrinal formulation. Okay. I mean, if you say, okay, we're not vying for the primacy, what does that mean? I would conclude that we're not vying for the primacy because we got it and you don't. I mean, how else would you interpret that? He's not denying the primacy.
Yeah.
But be that as it may, it's not even presented as a doctrinal formulation. And if it were, it'd be so ambiguous as to be meaningless.
Right. Yeah. So, this is just another example of how the Sedevacantists.
That's a good example.
Yeah, it's take infallibility to absurd limits for the purpose of trying to prove the church has defected. And that's what Louie is trying to prove here in this article. But the only thing he ends up proving is that he doesn't have any idea what he's talking about. That's what he proved in this article.
Yeah, I mean, it's even worse than what I've previously seen. I heard an Orthodox apologist the other day say he left the church because he has proven in his mind that the church has contradicted her definitive teachings with its own modern definitive teachings. And what he was referring to is Pope Boniface's teaching in Unum Sanctum that all must believe the Pope has temporal authority over all. Well, now because the church no longer teaches this, he left the church because he said the church contradicted her infallible teaching. The error, of course, there is that Pope Boniface was not defining that as a doctrine. It's something that he taught. But if you read Unum Sanctum, there's only one definition, and it's in the very last sentence of that doctrine, where we have to submit and adhere to the Roman Pontiff for salvation. So these errors are all over the place. But like you said, Louis extended it in the most extreme way possible.
Now, the error of that Orthodox apologist you're talking about is this. He doesn't understand the meaning of the ordinary universal magisterium. I reached out to that person privately through email.
Let's call him as Jay Dyer, right?
Jay Dyer, yeah. We'll go into this either later in this podcast or another podcast. All the Sedevacantists err on this. They don't know what the ordinary universal magisterium was.
Right.
They think it's a pope addressing a teaching to the universal church by his ordinary magisterium. That's right. They think that's the ordinary universal magisterium. It's not. Vatican I, it was clarified what the OUM is, and it is was clarified twice. Bishop Martin and one other bishop clarified during the council that it refers to the College of Bishops dispersed, not the bishops guy in the council, as John Daly mistakenly believes. It's the bishops dispersed. Matter of fact, the word universal, they said, was added so no one think it's referring to the Pope's magisterium.
Yeah, we'll cover that in another show because there's a lot we can say about.
There's a lot. And that's one of the that was one of the first errors of the Sedevacantists. Father Noel Barbara, he made that error to try to prove the conciliar popes weren't the true. He was one of the first Sedevacantists, and that was the error he used to try to prove the popes couldn't be the true popes because they erred, he thought, in a teaching addressed to the universal church. And one of the examples he gave was, of course, collegiality, which isn't an error at all. It's actually a true teaching.
Definitely.
Yeah, but let me just read just real quick, just to back up what we just said about infallibility. Let me read when the church teaches infallibly based on just basic catechisms. If Louis knew the Baltimore Catechism, he would be able to see through his error. Let's take a look at some of these basics. Here's a catechism of Pius X. Can the Pope err when teaching the church? Answer: the Pope cannot err. That is, he is infallible in the definitions regarding the faith. How is it the Pope is infallible? The Pope is infallible because of the promise of Jesus Christ and of the unfailing assistance of the Holy Ghost. When is the Pope infallible? The Pope is infallible when, as pastor and teacher of all Christians in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine regarding faith or morals to be held by all the church. Catechism of Pius X. Baltimore Catechism. What is meant by the infallibility of the Catholic Church? Answer: by the infallibility of the Catholic Church is meant that the Church, by the special assistance of the Holy Ghost, cannot err when it teaches or believes the doctrine of faith or morals. When does the Church teach infallibly? Answer: The church teaches infallibly when it defines through the Pope alone as a teacher of all Christians, or through the Pope and bishops, a doctrine of faith or morals to be held by all the faithful. Next point, it says the Holy Father must intend to use supreme apostolic authority when he teaches infallibly. B, the Pope can teach without speaking infallibly. For example, he does this in encyclical letters. So there you go. There's my Catholic faith teaches exactly the same.
Exactly what I said, Rob, and that's what I said to Louie. It's when the Pope defines. That's his error.
And then let me go ahead and just quickly read the definition of Pastor Eternus, the actual definition of papal infallibility, and then we'll go maybe a little further into that. So give me just a moment to pull that up. Okay, so here's the actual definition of papal infallibility from the First Vatican Council. This is in chapter 4, paragraph number 9. With the approval of the Sacred Council, we teach and define as a divinely revealed dogma that when the Roman Pontiff speaks ex cathedra, that is, when in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole church. He possesses, by the divine assistance promised to him in Blessed Peter, that infallibility which the Redeemer willed his church to enjoy in defining in doctrines concerning faith or morals. Therefore, such definitions of the Roman Pontiff are of themselves and not by the consent of the church irreformable. So 3 times we see it's when the Pope defines a doctrine. This last sentence here, where it says, such definitions of the Pope are of themselves and not by the consent of the church irreformable, is against the Gallican error, which maintained that there's only one subject of infallibility, which is the entire college. And therefore, because of that, they held that if the church defines a doctrine, it's only irreformable or infallible if it's received by the entire church, the entire college. That's what that last sentence is referring to. When you see, so sometimes you hear the Sedevacantists heretics claiming that we're Gallicanists. They don't understand what Gallican heresy is. No one denies that the Pope's infallible when he defines the doctrine ex cathedra. The Gallicans taught that he's not. It's only infallible if the entire church received it. That's the Gallican error that was condemned at Vatican I. To all the Sedevacantists watching this.
So that was very helpful. That definition is right there. I mean, that's the dogma. That is the dogma. I think even mainstream Catholics, and this isn't totally on point relative to infallibility, but they're also promoting this idea that anything from the magisterium is infallibly safe, and thus they end by concluding that all non-definitive teachings require religious assent, and thus there can never be public assent, which that is wrong. And I think some of the controversial statements of Vatican II, we can do another show on this, wouldn't even rise to the level of a Category 3 proposition. But anyway, we should just note that when the church speaks about divine assistance, there are 2 species of assistance, Rob, right? There's this species of assistance whereby the Holy Ghost prevents negatively the Pope when he manifests his will to define a doctrine, as we just read, that he will be protected from error. And that is one species of assistance. The other, which you can read about in Donum Veritatis number 17, is where the Holy Ghost will give divine assistance to all of the bishops, to the college, and especially to the Pope, particularly to the Pope, in his act of exercising his magisterium. But that doesn't guarantee safety, much less infallibility. It's a different species of assistance that certainly can be resisted by the Holy Father. And to the extent that the Holy Father has contradicted prior teachings or has implemented strange disciplines, et cetera, he would have resistance. Resisted that assistance. So the point there is not everything that is non-definitive automatically qualifies for religious assent, and we'll explain more about that later. So I'll maybe close with this.
Let me add a little more to that point. Is that so? The 2 species, one species divine assistance prevents the possibility of error.
Right.
The other one doesn't prevent the possibility of error. So the one that prevents possibility is infallible divine assistance.
Right.
There's also a divine assistance, but it doesn't prevent the possibility of error. Now, Cardinal Journet, he breaks the second charism out into two different species or categories, if you will. He says this. He says that non-definitive judgments or teachings, if they're consistent with what the church has always consistently and universally held, those doctrines, although they're not proposed as true or false, but only as safe or non-safe, those will always be safe or non-safe, as the church says. So if the church says you can't believe that women can be priests, even if it's not infallible, that will be infallibly safe to believe that, because that's what the church has always held. But if the church were to give a doctrinal judgment that was not consistent with what the church has always taught, he says that will not necessarily be infallibly safe to believe or infallibly prudent. So it depends on its conformity to tradition. So the really kind of three species of protection. One, negative protection prevents the possibility of error. The second one guarantees that what's always been taught by the church consistently, universally, will be safe to believe or not safe to believe, depending on how the church proposes it, safe or not safe. The third category, a novelty, not necessarily safe to believe or prudent for the church to teach. So there can be times when the church popes have taught things that were not safe to believe. And we can give plenty of examples of those.
Plenty, yeah.
We will later on give some examples of things that are not safe to believe or to hold. But so yeah. Now Franzlin only gave two species. He gave the infallible species, prevents error, and then non-definitive teachings, he said, will always be infallibly safe. I like Cardinal Journet's explanation better. They'll always be infallibly safe if they're consistent with what the church has always taught. If not, they may not always be infallibly safe. I like that. That's a better distinction. Yeah.
And history proves that's the correct distinction.
Right, exactly. History proves that's right.
Right. No, I agree with that completely.
Also, Franzlin, it's also important to note that he was limiting that to direct doctrinal judgments from the Pope or from a congregation. So these are things that were doctrines that were studied by a congregation. You have the whole list, the whole process, studied by a congregation, approved by a Pope. Those will be infallibly safe, he said. Not everything a Pope says, but direct doctrinal judgments. Matter of fact, he did not include in his explanation disciplinary judgments, only direct doctrinal judgments.
Right.
So
we'll get into that when we talk about non-definitive teachings. We'll have more to say about that. I would say this, though, before we kick off in more detail. The Catholic approach to infallibility is that nothing is infallible unless it's manifestly evident.
Yep.
And that's actually what canon law says in canon 749. I think it's sub 3. And so that means that it's the Pope or a council defining, right? Something that's taught always and everywhere from the beginning. So that's the key. The Pope has to be making his intention to define. It has to be manifestly evident. And that's because it's an exercise of the keys of binding and loosing. And we'll get into that a little bit more. If the Pope is what I would say teaching as Peter, right? Christ gave Peter the keys and the authority to bind or loose. If the Pope is manifesting his will to bind the church, then we know that he'll invoke that charism. Otherwise, he's not infallible and he could err. And the theologians would say in those cases, he's only teaching as a private doctor or a private theologian or a private person, even though through his magisterium, he still doesn't have that charism. So I think with that, Rob, if you want to kick off with some more detail on Pastor Eternus.
Well, just before we get to that real quick, let me just see what Bishop Gasser said in the Relatio. Relatio is the official explanation of papal infallibility that was given to the Council Fathers before their vote on infallibility in Vatican I. He explained the doctrine, answered objections to it, like 4-hour speech. This is one thing he said. He was asked the question, in what sense is pontifical infallibility absolute? So Gasser said, I reply and openly admit, in no sense is pontifical infallibility absolute, because absolute infallibility belongs to God alone, who is the first and essential truth, and who is never able to deceive or be deceived. All other infallibility, as communicated for a specific purpose, has its limits and its conditions under which it is considered to be present. The same is valid in reference to the infallibility of the Roman Pontiff. For this infallibility is bound by certain limits and conditions. He's going to get into the conditions next. So infallibility is not a habitual charism that's constantly with the Pope. It's only in act when the Pope is defining a doctrine. When he's not defining a doctrine, the negative charism is not present. So it's not a habitual charism that he always enjoys. It's when he's walking around. When he's defining a doctrine, that charism is present to prevent the possibility of error. So scrolling down here, Gasser is going to give the conditions for infallibility described as the conditions regarding the subject, the object, and the act. Okay, so here he goes. Therefore, in reality, the infallibility of the Roman pontiff is restricted by reason of the subject. That is, when the Pope, constituted in the chair of Peter, the center of the church, speaks as universal teacher and supreme judge. Okay, it's restricted by the act. It's restricted by the object when treating of faith and morals, and by reason of the act itself when the Pope defines a doctrine to be believed or held by all the faithful. So the subject of infallibility, as Bishop Gasser explains a little later, is that it's the Pope acting as a public person in relation to the universal church. So that means if a Pope was acting just as Bishop of Rome or as a Patriarch of the West, and he defined a doctrine for the entire Diocese of Rome, it would not be infallible. He has to be defining for the entire church. It's in relation to the entire church the Pope's infallible. So that's the subject, the Pope in relation to the universal church. The object is of faith and morals. The act, this is the key. The act is when the Pope defines, and Gasser goes on to explain that there has to be an internal and external intention to define a doctrine. What does that mean? Internal, he has to intend to define a doctrine, giving a final definitive judgment on the matter, not just proposing it, but a final definitive judgment. Externally, that means he has to manifest the intention to define. So if the Pope does not manifest his intention, I'm defining this doctrine as a final definitive act, it's not infallible. That's why it's so restricted. It's only when a Pope defines with the manifest intention of defining ex cathedra that he's infallible. Any comments on that, John, before I continue?
Well, hopefully our viewers are understanding how limited the charism is, right? There are many conditions, and Pastor Tenner sets them forth, but Gasser then elucidates on them and makes distinctions among them. So a lot has to happen for this to be this charism to be triggered.
So let me pull this up real quick, just so I can quote Gasser, stating that the intention has to be manifest to define. All right.
Yeah, so when Gasser says it must be manifest, that's actually the language of canon law, canon 749. The intention must be manifestly evident.
Yep.
And that makes sense, right? I mean, the Pope has to manifest his intention to exercise the keys, to bind the church. It has to be manifest. We have to know that the Pope is teaching as Peter, the authority that Christ gave Peter. Well, that authority exists whenever he binds or looses.
Something else we'll get to in a minute is that the theologians, until just recently, only considered a Pope to be teaching as Pope when he defined a doctrine ex cathedra. If he was teaching in a way that was not an actual definition, he was considered teaching as a private person,
right,
even though he was teaching authoritatively.
Right.
So we have the three categories right now. We have Pope teaching ex cathedra. We have the Pope teaching with his authentic magisterium, and then the Pope could just teach as a private person, really. But the second two categories, the early theologians considered a Pope teaching as a private person, even when he was teaching authoritatively. What today we call the authentic magisterium. They call that the Pope teaching as a private person. Why? Because he's only considered teaching as Pope when he defined a doctrine. So they only had two categories: Pope teaching as Pope.
Yeah, and I always say I always say as Peter, because the keys were given to Peter and his successors.
Right.
So if he's teaching as Peter, right, he's binding and loosing. If he's not teaching as Peter. He's not teaching as the Pope in that traditional understanding.
Yes, and Alfonso said he only exercises pontifical authority when he teaches definitively, binding and loosing. Yeah. So here's what Gasser says on the manifest intention. I want to quote this directly.
Okay.
He says, secondly, not any manner of proposing the doctrine is sufficient, even when he is exercising his office as supreme pastor and teacher. Notice that. Even exercise his office as supreme pastor and teacher, not any way of proposing doctrine suffices. Rather, says Gasser, there is required the manifest intention of defining a doctrine, either of putting an end to a doubt about a certain doctrine, or of defining a thing, giving a definitive judgment, and proposing that the doctrine as one which must be held by the universal church. This last point is indeed something intrinsic to every dogmatic definition of faith or morals, which is taught by the supreme pastor and teacher of the universal church, and which is to be held by the universal church. So it requires a manifest intention of defining. Like John said, canon law itself requires that.
This is something important too. What you said, I picked up on. This is another very important point. The Pope can exercise his universal jurisdiction. In fact, I'll go through some examples where he does so and has erred, right? So there's a distinction between universal jurisdiction and the exercising the keys and binding and loosing, right? If he's binding and loosing the entire church, of course, that's an exercise of universal jurisdiction, but not all acts of universal jurisdiction are infallible. In fact, most of them aren't. Think about it. Think about all the times the Pope is teaching the universal church, but not defining doctrine. That's almost always the case, right? So he is exercising a plenary, universal, supreme jurisdiction over the church in his teaching capacity, but that doesn't mean it's infallible. In fact, it's almost not. It's almost never infallible.
Yeah, Franzlin distinguished between supreme magisterium in substance and supreme magisterium in intention or in aim. So substance is the Pope, he's always teaching with the supreme magisterium. If he's directly teaching the universal church, it's always his supreme magisterium because he holds the supreme magisterium. The supreme magisterium is the Pope, or it's the Pope together with all the bishops. That's the supreme magisterium. There's also the aim or the intention, like Franzlin says. He has to intend to bind for the supreme intention to be present, to teach infallibly.
In my mind, I think of it as matter and form. I mean, the matter is the Pope teaching universally, but the form is what is he intending to teach? Is he intending to bind or not to bind? But he uses the word substance. So that's fine.
So again, we've seen the conditions for papal infallibility. Anything else to add to that before I move to the next issue?
I was going to ask you, well, here's something that always comes up. Does Pastor Eternus teach that a Pope is unable to fall into formal heresy, personal heresy?
Right, yeah. The short answer is no. Let me give you the longer answer. The longer answer is sometimes it helps to know the history of these things. So the history of whether or not a Pope can fall into personal heresy. The first theologian we know of who taught that a Pope is unable to fall into personal heresy was Albert Pigius in his book on the ecclesiastical hierarchy, published in 1538. It's book 1, chapter 8, which I just read 2 days ago, matter of fact. So he was the first theologian we know of to hold to that position. And his argument was that the promise of unfailing faith that Christ promised to Peter, well, we know that also applies to his successors. Therefore, if Peter couldn't lose his faith, neither can his successor lose his faith. Okay. Now, theologians immediately came out and refuted him. How do they do so? By appealing to the traditional distinction, which is there's two privileges contained within that promise that Christ made to Peter. The first privilege guaranteed that Peter would not lose his personal faith. He would preserve to the end. He would not lose his personal faith. The second privilege prevented Peter from erring, even materially, when he defined a doctrine, basically. Defined doctrine ex cathedra. He was prevented from erring. And they said only the second privilege was passed on to Peter's successors, not the first. Only the second. What's the second privilege? That Peter can't err, or his successors, when they define a doctrine ex cathedra for the entire church. That's the second privilege. So Melchior Cano, the famous theologian from the Council of Trent, came out and immediately refuted that opinion of Pigius with the explanation I just gave. Dominic Baines came out, refuted that opinion. Also, if you look at the commentary of Cornelius a Lapide, which was published also in the mid-1500s, he also makes that same distinction between the two promises and says two privileges. The second privilege alone was passed on to Peter's successors. And Bellarmine adopted Pigius's. Also, I'll back up and say that when Melchior Cano refuted Pigius' opinion, he called it a new opinion. So not only does everyone point to Pigius as the first who taught this, Melchior Cano confirms this is a new opinion. It wasn't heard of before before Pigius taught it in 1538. But in spite of that, Bellarmine adopted Pigius's novel opinion, but he only held it as being probable, which is a super low grade of certainty. Matter of fact, he said the opinion of Pigius is probable and piously can be believed. He said, but the common opinion is that a pope can lose his faith. So you'll hear Bellarmine taught that a pope can't lose his faith. Well, he held that opinion as probable, while admitting that the more common opinion is that he could lose his faith. And you can verify that in De Romano Pontifice, Book 2, Chapter 30, the very beginning, he says that. Other places too, but that's where you can confirm it. So, but let's see what Bellarmine says about that.
Yeah.
Bellarmine says this on the two privileges. The promise of the Lord in Luke 22, as we find in the Greek, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has asked for you that he might sift you like wheat. Yet I have prayed for thee that thy faith would not fail. The true exposition is that the Lord asked for two privileges for Peter. One, that he could not ever lose the true faith insofar as he was tempted by the devil. The second privilege is that he, as Pope, and that means defining ex cathedra, as I'll show a little later. The second privilege is that he, as Pope, could never teach something against the faith, or that there would never be found one in his see who would teach against the true faith. And that's teaching ex cathedra. From these privileges, says Bellarmine, we see that the first did not remain to his successors, but the second, without a doubt, did. Now, that bolded sentence right there is actually not the best translation. It should say that from these two privileges, the first may not have passed on to his successor, but the second definitely did. So that's Bellarmine, the two privileges. Again, I could read a lot more quotes from other theologians who say the same thing. Two privileges, but traditionally it was held that only the second was passed on to Saint Peter. So with that in mind, the question you asked, John, is what did Vatican I teach about the Pope falling into personal heresy?
Yeah, because I mean, some accuse. I mean, some say Gasser is really saying that Pastor Ternus is teaching the opinion of Pigius.
We'll get to that's what I'll read. Right.
Some say that, but you go. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me pull it up here real quick. Let's see. Gasser Verrecchio, share. All right. So let's get down here to Pigius. All right. So Gasser says this. Okay, he says now I'm going to skip some part. If you see this, I'm going to skip the part in black. This part in black is referring to the fourth proposition of the Gallican, which is refuted in the last sentence of the definition of papal infallibility, which is that for a ex cathedra definition of the Pope to be irreformable, the entire church has to accept. That's what this is referring to. I'm going to skip that because that's just in the middle and kind of the way. So here's what Gasser says. Now, before I end this relatio, I should respond to the most grave objection which has been made from this podium, namely that we wish to make an extreme opinion of a certain school of theology a dogma of the Catholic faith. Indeed, this is a very grave objection, and when I heard it from the mouth of an outstanding and most esteemed speaker, I hung my head sadly and pondered well before speaking. Good God, you have so confused our minds and our tongues that we are misrepresented as promoting the elevation of extreme opinion of a certain school to the dignity of a dogma. What's that extreme opinion? Dropping down, let's find out. As far as the doctrine set forth in the draft goes, the deputation is unjustly accused of wanting to raise an extreme opinion, namely that of Albert Pigius to the dignity of a dogma. For the opinion of Albert Pigius, which Bellarmine indeed calls pious and probable, was that the Pope, as an individual person or private teacher, was able to err from a type of ignorance, but was never able to fall into heresy or teach heresy. Okay? That's the opinion of Pigius. To say nothing of the other points, let me say that this is clear from the very words of Bellarmine, both in the citation made by the Reverend Speaker and also from Bellarmine himself, who, in Book 4, Chapter 6, pronounces on the opinion of Pigius in the following words. It can be believed probably and piously, see, he's a piously and probably, that the Supreme Pontiff is not only not able to err as Pontiff, ex cathedra, but that even as a particular person, he is not able to be heretical by pertinaciously believing something contrary to faith. That's the extreme opinion. The extreme opinion is that a Pope can't fall into personal heresy. Okay, Gasser continues, from this, it is apparent the doctrine in the proposed chapter is not that of Albert Pigius or the extreme opinion of any school, but rather it's one and the same which Bellarmine teaches in the place cited by the reverend speaker, and which Bellarmine adduces in the fourth place and calls most certain and assured. And so he doesn't call it pious and probable. He calls the other opinion he's defining as most certain and assured. That's what Gasser's saying right here. Or rather, correcting himself, the most common and certain opinion, Bellarmine calls the one that's being defined. So scrolling down, this is the opinion that's being defined. Here's the fourth opinion right here. Let me read the ones that precede it, because Bellarmine refers to a certain opinion here as an extreme opinion, just like Gasser did. Ready? Second opinion is that the Pope, even as Pope, defining, can be a heretic and teach heresy if he defines something without a general council, something that this opinion holds did in fact happen. So the second opinion is the Pope can err if he defines the doctrine as Pope, ex cathedra. Okay, Bellarmine rejects that. The third opinion is another extreme. So this is an extreme. The third opinion is another extreme. Well, just like Gasser, an extreme. What's this extreme? That the Pope cannot in any way be a heretic nor publicly teach heresy, even if he alone should define some matter. As our Pigius says, that's the extreme opinion of Pigius, that the Pope cannot fall into heresy in any way. Okay?
So they obviously don't agree with the Church's condemnations of Pope Honorius then, right?
Right. So, but here's the fourth. This is the one that Gasser just said the Church is defining. It's the fourth opinion, which is this. The one that Bellarmine calls certain. The fourth opinion is in a certain way in the middle of the two. It's between the two. It maintains that the pontiff, whether he can be a heretic or not, he cannot in any way define a heretical proposition that must be believed by the whole Church. This is very common opinion among all Catholics. Scrolling down a little bit, the fourth opinion is very certain. So he calls it certain, common and certain, just like Gasser said. The fourth opinion is very certain and should be affirmed. And we will state a few propositions so that can be understood and confirmed more easily. So again, Gasser says Vatican I is not teaching the extreme opinion of Albert Pigius, that the Pope can't fall into personal heresy. Instead, it's teaching the fourth proposition, which is the Pope, whether or not he can fall into heresy, he can't err when he defines the doctrine.
Right.
That's what Vatican I defined, not the opinion of Albert Pigius, which unfortunately, I think Ron Conti actually says Vatican I defined. Ron Conti says Vatican I defined the opinion of Pigius, when Gasser says the exact opposite. So, and I'm going to link below to my refutation of Ron Conti. He wrote an article against John and myself, and so I wrote a response to him. So I'll link that below here so you can read that. But also, the book, The Gift of Infallibility, a great book by Father O'Connor, which goes through the relatio of Bishop Gasser and has some other good information at the end. But he says this, he confirms that Bishop Gasser is saying Vatican I is not defining the opinion of Albert Pigius. So he says, this is from Father O'Connor's book, written in like the late 80s, I believe. Before completing his general relatio and turning to the suggested corrections to the draft, Gasser considers one last charge of those opposed to the draft, namely that it is simply canonizing the most extreme pro-papal opinion of one school of theology, that of Albert Pigius. Albert Pigius was a Dutch theologian, continues Father O'Connor, and a strong defender of papal infallibility, and in sometimes exaggerated form. He is generally understood to have defended the thesis that the Pope, even as a private person, was unable to fall into heresy. Using Robert Bellarmine as a source, Gasser maintains that this is probable and pious opinion, but it is not this opinion that the draft proposes to define, since Gasser has been at pains to stress that the draft is treating the Pope in his role as a public person, supreme teacher of the Church, when he defines the doctrine of faith and morals for the entire Church, a position Bellarmine held as common and certain, as we read in the fourth opinion that Gasser said Bellarmine, the Church was defined. So no, that Pastorus does not teach that a Pope is unable to fall into personal heresy, which unfortunately a lot of Catholics today, including Dr. Fastigi, claim. They claim that Pastor Turnus defined that a Pope is unable to fall into personal heresy. So what does Dr. Fastigi base his claim on? He bases his claim on, let me pull up again, Pastor Eternus, and show what Dr. Fastigi bases his claim on, that Vatican I defined that a pope's unable to fall into personal heresy. All right, so he appeals to Pastor Eternus, chapter 4, which is the chapter in which papal infallibility is defined. There's 9 paragraphs in this chapter. The first 8 give a historical argument for the doctrine being defined in paragraph number 9. Okay, right. So Dr. Fastigi appeals to paragraph number 7. See if you can spot what Dr. Fastigi's error is. Okay, here's the quote. I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again or been converted, strengthen your brethren. This gift of truth and never failing faith was therefore divinely conferred on Peter and his successors in this see, so that they might discharge their exalted office. So the fact that this gift, never failing faith, was given to Peter's successors, Dr. Fastigi says that Vatican I, therefore, is teaching the Pope can't lose his personal faith. But as we have already seen, there's 2 privileges within that gift. One of them prevented Peter from losing his personal faith. The other prevented from teaching erring when he taught ex cathedra. Obviously, this is referring to the second privilege. We know it's not the first because Bishop Gasser just said that's not teaching the first privilege, just the second privilege. Right. The second privilege, he can't err when defining ex cathedra. First 8 paragraphs of Pastor Eternus are giving a historical and theological argument for the doctrine being defined in paragraph 9. So the gift of truth and unfailing faith was conferred on Peter's successors, guarantees he won't err when he defines ex cathedra. Nothing about not losing the faith. So there's Dr. Fastigi's error. Does not teach a pope is unable to lose his personal faith. It teaches he can't err when he defines ex cathedra. That's what that gift guarantees. And that's how Vatican I used that sentence in Pastor Eternus chapter 4, just as tradition maintained prior to that point.
Yeah, I didn't know you were going to bring that up, but I would add to this. The church fathers, when they look to Luke 22 and John 21, they generally use those verses to support the primacy, okay, but not infallibility. Infallibility rests primarily upon Matthew 16, when Christ gives Peter the keys and says, whatever you bind or loose on earth, the entire earth is bound or loosed in heaven. Certainly he's referring to universal jurisdiction because he's binding over the whole earth, but he's binding the church to something. He's not merely strengthening his brethren and tending the lambs and feeding the sheep, which he does as universal pastor. But the act of the keys, we go back to Isaiah 22, opening and shutting, binding and loosing. This is a definitive act. This is the definitive act of defining, the ex cathedra from the chair defining. And so I don't know how, and I respect Dr. Fastigi, but that's not how that verse was even used among the patristics to support infallibility, even personal infallibility.
Bellarmine quoted 7 popes to defend the idea that the promise of Christ to Peter, prevented a pope from erring when he defining ex cathedra. None of them taught that it prevented a pope from erring as a
personal.
Yeah. And I'll include these quotes below so you can read them.
Sure.
But again, 7 popes, and then also in Cornelius a Lapide, when he lists the 2 privileges, he references when he argues that the second privilege alone was passed on to Peter's successors. He references that teaching of Bellarmine I just mentioned, where Bellarmine quotes the 7 popes, saying the privilege prevents the pope from erring when he defines ex cathedra. So I'll include these quotes below this podcast.
Yeah, and it also goes to this is a little off topic, but it goes to the question of, whether the Pope has the interior virtue and whether he needs the interior virtue to act as Pope and exercise jurisdiction, which he clearly doesn't, right? So, you raise a bunch of issues when you say, well, if the Pope can fall into personal heresy, then what happens? Does he lose his jurisdiction? And if he loses his jurisdiction without the church knowing about it, don't we have an invisible church? It's very problematic to go down that road.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, we can also confirm that Vatican I did not teach what Dr. Fazzi claims by reading the old manuals. So if Vatican I had defined that a pope is unable to fall into personal heresy, obviously the council, the manuals published after that would confirm that, right? Let's see what they actually confirm. Here's a quote from Cardinal Mazzella. He was the head, held the chair of theology at the Gregorian during the pontificate of Leo XIII. Okay, here's what he says. It is one thing that the Roman pontiff cannot teach a heresy when he speaks ex cathedra, what the Vatican Council defined. And it is another thing that he cannot fall into heresy. That is, become a heretic as a private person. On this last question, the council said nothing. Indeed, some, such as Albert Pigius, deny that a Roman pontiff, even as a private person, could fall into what is properly called heresy. That is, knowingly and obstinately adhering to an error contrary to faith already condemned. Bellarmine inclines more toward this opinion. So here we see Cardinal Mazzella saying the council said nothing about the idea of a pope falling into personal heresy. Coronata, 1950. It cannot be proven, however, that the Roman pontiff, as a private teacher, cannot become a heretic if, for example, he would contumaciously deny a previously defined dogma. Such impeccability was never promised by God. Indeed, Pope Innocent III expressly admits such a possibility. Again, if Vatican I would have ruled it out, he would have said so. Horatio Mazzella says, this is 1915, by virtue of the gift of infallibility, the pontiff cannot fall into heresy when he speaks ex cathedra. That was defined in the Vatican Council. But theologians dispute whether he can, as a private person, become a true heretic, adhering publicly and pertinaciously to an error against the faith. Again, affirming what the contrary of what Dr. Fazzi claims Vatican I taught. Father Barry, the council declared the Roman pontiff personally infallible when he speaks officially as head of the universal church, but left untouched the question whether the Pope in his private capacity or in his official capacity as bishop, primate, or patriarch can fall into heresy and teach heresy. Some theologians maintain that he can. Straub, Adrian II, Innocent III, as favors his opinion. So the manuals published after Vatican I confirm Vatican I did not teach what Dr. Fazzi claims that it taught. It did not teach that a pope was unable to fall into personal heresy. So that should settle that point.
Yeah. So Rob, you had said that when the pope is not defining a doctrine on faith or morals, he's teaching as a private person. I mean, I've heard some theologians say private doctor, private theologian, but not as pope, even though he's exercising his magisterium. He's not teaching as pope. Do you have any quotes on that to back that up?
Yeah. So here's a quote from St. Alphonsus Liguori, Doctor of the Church, where he says this. We said, if the Pope falls into heresy as a private person, because the Pope, as Pope, that is to say, teaching the whole church ex cathedra, cannot teach error against the faith because Christ's promise cannot fail. So there, Pope teaching as Pope, he equates with teaching the church ex cathedra. Dominic Soto, he wrote, although some masters of our time sustain that the Pope cannot be a heretic in any way, the common opinion is, however, the opposite one. For though he might not be able to err as Pope, that is, he could not define an error as an article of faith, because the Holy Spirit will not permit it. Nevertheless, as a private person, he can err in faith in the same way that he can commit other sins because he is not impeccable. So there, they equate the Pope teaching as Pope when he defines a doctrine for the entire church. Here's Father Divine's the Catechism Explained. He writes this. He mentions, again, two ways the Pope could teach. This was the late 19th century. He says, the Pope can teach A, as a private doctor, as other men and theologians, by writing and editing books, and even by writing doctrinal epistles. So notice, doctrinal epistles come from the Pope as a private doctor. Right. But it is certain that these writings have no pontifical authority and are not to be looked upon as infallible documents. Okay, that's the first way he can teach. B, the second way he can teach. He can teach as pontiff, and he is considered to teach as such as often as he speaks ex cathedra. So notice, two ways the Pope can teach: as a private doctor, even in doctrinal epistles, or as Pope, as pontiff, when he defines ex cathedra. Those are the two ways. So really, the third way, teaching the authoritative magisterium, is included in this first way, teaching as a private doctor. It's odd because the terminology is not the best, because he's not really teaching as a private person, but he's not teaching as Pope. That's the key point. He was only considered teaching as Pope when he defined ex cathedra. Bellarmine says this. You might say, but certainly the councils believe the Pope could err. I respond, this is regarding Honorius, those fathers only believed the Pope could err as a private man, which is a probable opinion, although the contrary seems more probable to us. That is all Honorius is accused of, that he fostered heresy in a private letter. Was that a private letter? Was Honorius's letter to Sergius, his 2 letters to Sergius, in which he was condemned by 3 ecumenical councils to be a heretic? Were those private letters? No, those aren't private letters. Those were letters, as Franklin says, those were public letters. From his office as Pope.
And an act of universal jurisdiction, since he's teaching outside of the Diocese of Rome.
Yet Bellarmine calls it teaching a Pope as a private person because it wasn't ex cathedra.
Because he wasn't defining a doctrine. He didn't say, I hereby declare and define that Christ had one will. It's as simple as that.
Yep. Next quote. This is from Bellarmine addressing Pope Nicholas's error, who taught that baptism in the name of Jesus or the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost is valid. The name of Jesus is not valid.
Again, outside his diocese to the Bulgarians.
The Bulgarians, that's right. So here's what Bellarmine said about that. And this, by the way, this teaching of Pope Nicholas, this private teaching, is in Denziger's to this day. I think it's in 365 in Denziger's to this day. Bellarmine says
it's
this.
It's magisterial.
Yes, magisterial. What we today would call magisterial. It meets a definition of magisterial in today's terminology.
Right.
Bellarmine says, I respond. Nicholas was not defining a question on faith when he spoke. Rather, he only expressed his opinion in passing as a private teacher. A private teacher? This is a magisterial document from Pope Nicholas as Pope Nicholas to the Bulgarians.
And it's a responsum to a dubium about whether the baptismal formula is valid or invalid.
Right, exactly. Yes, so there's Bellarmine saying the Pope teaching in his capacity as, from his office as Pope, is teaching as a private teacher in what today we call a magisterial document.
Only because he's not defining. He's not defining.
Exactly. Listen to what St. Alphonsus says next. Yet the fourth opinion is common, to which we subscribe. The Roman pontiff, insofar as he is a particular person or private person, can err, just as he is fallible in questions of mere fact, which especially depend upon the testimony of men. Nevertheless, when the Pope speaks as the universal doctor, defining ex cathedra, namely, by the supreme power bestowed upon Peter to teach the church, then we say he is infallible. See, in determining controversies of faith and morals. So again, he's teaching as Pope when he defines the doctrine ex cathedra. Another quote from St. Alphonsus below, he says, regarding the error of Honorius, he says, who does not know the epistles of Honorius were private and not dogmatic, in which Honorius defined nothing, but only disclosed his private opinion. See, for he conceded the Pope could err as men when responding in private writings, but not as teacher of the church by teaching the faithful ex cathedra. For when the privilege of infallibility is added for the good of the church, God refuses that the person be joined it to the office, and then only does he exercise pontifical office. Notice that. Only when he's speaking infallibly, then only does he exercise pontifical office, according to St. Alphonsus. So, again, when he's not teaching as Pope, the older theologians are not teaching as a private person. Only teaching as Pope when he defined a doctrine ex cathedra. Here's something else from Fessler. This is interesting, along the same lines. He says, this is one of the cases, following up on something he just said, this is one of the cases which theologians mean when they say the Pope as a private individual may err in a matter of faith. That is, when he is considered simply as a man with merely his own human conception of a doctrine of faith. As Pope, as supreme teacher of the Catholic Church, he cannot err when, by virtue of the assistance of God, promised and vouchsafed to him, he solemnly defines the truth revealed by God and prescribes it to be held by the universal church. It is clear that there are in one person of the Pope two different active powers. First, the ordinary power of thinking and viewing things. And secondly, the solemn defining power of the whole church. See, when he's not exercising the solemn defining power, he's the Pope acting by his human powers. He may have divine assistance, but his apology doesn't prevent the possibility of error. And he goes on to quote Ballerini teaching the same thing. Do you have a comment on that, John?
I'd like the viewers to understand, the apologetics basis, really, which comes from revelation on infallibility. Understand the connection between earth and heaven, because when Christ gives Peter the authority to bind or loose on earth what is bound or loosed in heaven, here you have a scripture that says that heaven is ratifying the decisions of earth. And since heaven can't lie, right? Heaven can't err. It necessarily follows that what is being bound or what is being defined, same thing, must be without error. Otherwise, heaven couldn't ratify it. And that's exactly very important. Right. It's right in divine revelation.
Exactly. Charles Jordan has a beautiful teaching on that. He speaks of how Pius XII teaches that when someone baptizes, it's Christ baptizing. When a pope offers mass, it's Christ offering mass. They're instruments of Christ operating through them. He said, but when the church defines the doctrine, it's not Christ acting through them as an instrument. Rather, the church is a secondary cause. So the church formulates and defines and proposes the doctrine, but when it does so, Christ raises that up and makes that teaching his own. He binds in heaven what's bound on earth. Just like you said.
Right.
His teaching on that's really beautiful. I wish I had a quote. One more teaching here of Bellarmine. This is on the error of Gregory II. Gregory II taught that if a spouse was unable to have marital relations, that her husband, ideally he'd remain with her. But if he couldn't contain himself, he's able to marry a second wife. All right. And this is not, as Bellarmine points out, Gregory's not talking about an unconsummated marriage, which can be dissolved. He's just talking about a marriage where the wife, maybe she contracts AIDS, so you can't have relations with her.
Well, I would say, Rob, he's talking about a sacramental marriage.
Yeah.
That's the key here, okay?
Yeah.
He's exercising his universal jurisdiction and responding to a dubium as to whether the man can leave a sacramental marriage and remarry for incontinence because his wife could no longer have relations.
Right.
And so he is not exercising the Petrine or Pauline privilege here because this was a sacramental marriage. And so this clearly was an error in the exercise of the Pope's magisterium, an error on faith or morals, and a grave error at that.
Yep. So here's what Bellarmine said in response to the Bellarmine. You got to understand that Catholics are always Pope explainers. Catholics are popes. They try their best to explain away any error of the Pope. That's what Catholics do. The heretics,
you don't need to do, but you don't need to do that though if you understand the hierarchy of authority, right?
Exactly.
So here's what Bellarmine said in his attempt to kind of explain away the error of Gregory. He says that because the Lutherans object. I answer that, first of all, one must marvel that the Lutherans consider this to be an error, since Luther also taught the same, as is shown by John Cochlea. Next, I say that Gregory was not speaking about just any kind of sickness, but of permanent and natural impotence, by which a woman is unfit for marriage. For such marriage contracted by error are considered not to be marriages and are dissolved by the judgment of the church, as we see in the decrees and in the gloss responses. But on the contrary, says Bellarmine, there is this, that Gregory seems to judge that the first marriage was a true marriage and that it should not be dissolved, but that a second marriage should be added to it. For he writes that a husband should not withdraw support from his former wife. What Gregory said is that he can marry a second wife, but he has to take care of the first one financially. That's what Bellarmine's saying there. That is, he should still care for and support her as a wife, says Bellarmine. Therefore, it could be said that with this same gloss, that the pontiff was speaking about our weakness, not permitting another marriage as being just, but as less evil, says Bellarmine. For it is less evil for a man to have only one concubine than that he should commit fornication with many. There's Bellarmine's excuse. Or certainly the pontiff fell from ignorance. We do not deny that this may happen to the popes when they do not define anything as a matter of faith, but only decree their opinions to others, as Gregory seems to have done in this place. Nor may it be said that this error of Gregory is manifest heresy against the gospel. For Gregory did not teach that it is possible to divorce one's wife and take another, which is expressly against the gospel and the law of nature, but he just taught that it's in certain cases, and with the wife's permission, a man can take another wife so that one man may have two wives, like Abraham did. No big deal, right?
Yeah.
There's Bellarmine's attempt at pope-splaining. But the point is, he's saying he's giving his private opinion here, even though he's answering to a dubia as pope. He's giving his private opinion on a private doctrine.
Right. So you don't need to go that far. I mean, Robert Bellarmine, Doctor of the Church, and pope-splainer. You don't need to go that far here.
Right.
The Pope erred on a matter of faith and morals, and it was a very grave one.
Which Bellarmine did say he may err. Hey, he's a private person. He's giving his opinion, he says, even though it's the Pope answering a duty. What if
it's an error, though, Rob, against the indissolubility of sacramental marriage? I mean, that is a dogma of the faith.
Something that Bousseau said about that, commenting on that, he said that there wasn't a clear distinction at the time between a marriage that had not been consummated and a marriage that where the spouse was incontinent after marriage. He said that was still being worked out by the canonists. It wasn't until later that the idea of an unconsummated marriage being able to be dissolved came about. That was later. So that's another reason you can't say that Gregory was referring to an unconsummated marriage.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Right. The evidence doesn't support that. Right.
Because later pope-splainers tried to explain it that way, saying, "Oh, it's unconsummated marriage." No, that's not.
No,
that can't apply.
That's not the case.
No, right.
And sacramental as well.
Yeah.
Well, Pope Celestine had a similar error, right? He answered a dubia in which you concluded that these are the two that I'm aware of, that an abandoned spouse, the man actually left the faith. They were baptized, right? So this is a sacramental marriage. The man left the faith.
Yep.
And Celestine III, concluded that the woman could remarry, even though the first marriage was sacramental, and she did not have to return to her first husband, who converted back to the faith and wanted her back.
Right.
And we know that Pope Innocent II, his immediate successor, reversed that error. Yep. So there you go.
So Celestine and Urban III taught that error. They taught that if a spouse, valid marriage, if one spouse departs from the faith and leaves, the other spouse can remarry.
Now imagine if Francis did that today.
Exactly. What if Francis taught what Gregory II? Imagine. Everyone becomes
they'd be hanging him in St. Peter's Square. I mean, that would be it, right? The church would implode at that point.
Yep.
No, the popes can err if they're not defining, folks.
Yep, and they have erred. But the point is that the older theologians only consider the Pope teaching as Pope when he defined ex cathedra. Well, today we call the authentic magisterium. They would have called the Pope teaching as a private person. So, and also Pope Gregory the 16th, in his book, The Triumph of the Holy See, he says this very point. He says that he makes two categories of papal teaching: the Pope teaching as Pope by defining a doctrine, the Pope teaching as a private person. But then he makes a distinction with the Pope teaching as a private person. In one case, it's the Pope teaching authoritatively. The other is the Pope just writing a private book. But he calls the Pope teaching authoritatively, but non-definitively, the Pope teaching as a private person. So the reason for this is you have to, if you're reading the older theologians, you have to realize when they talk about the Pope teaching as Pope, it's the Pope defining ex cathedra. The third category really developed after Vatican I. Cardinal Franzl, in his book on divine tradition, really excellent book. He talks about how some of the theologians at the time didn't accept the category of an authentic magisterium of the Pope. Even in 1875, when he wrote that second edition of his book, He says some theologians didn't accept that second category and didn't accept the idea of religious assent. The question came up, okay, the Pope requires the assent of faith when he defines ex cathedra, but what if he teaches a doctrine, or the Holy Office teaches a doctrine, he approves it, that's not a definition ex cathedra? What's required then? Franzl said religious assent is required then. And he limited that religious assent to not to anything a Pope happened to say, but to doctrinal decrees of a congregation. These are doctrinal propositions that the congregation looked at, studied, came out with, the Pope approved, doctrinal propositions of a congregation. Right. That's what Franzl said would be infallibly safe. Not anything a Pope said, as everyone today seems to think. Right. Doctrinal propositions only. That's what Franzl.
And remember, those doctrinal propositions were studied by theological advisors in depth. You know, they were debated and vetted, you know, before the congregation would issue a decree.
Right.
You know, that the Pope, you know, would then approve in forma communi or in forma specifica.
Chupin goes through all the steps.
Yeah.
First it goes off to the qualifiers. They qualify it as
right.
And then it goes to the consultors. Then it goes to the cardinals, and they vote on the whole process.
Sure.
Very end, the Pope approves it. That's what Franzl said would be infallibly safe. Those doctrines, not just anything a Pope happened to say, which is what everyone today seems to think. So, all right. So where do you want to go from here?
Well, we have a lot more to cover, Rob. I mean, I want to talk about Category 3 teachings in detail, as well as the ordinary and universal magisterium. You want to save that for another episode? Maybe we can do that.
Let's do it now.
You want to do it now? Okay.
Yeah. So, all right, what do you want to start with? The non-definitive teachings or the OUM?
Well, we can do non-definitive, since you just kind of teed that up.
Okay.
I think, you know, it's important to point out that the non-definitive teachings, if you look at the Professio, and again, we're going to be referring to the Profession of Faith of John Paul II, 1989, you know, where we have Category 1 truths, which are truths that the Church proposes as divinely revealed, right, that have to be believed with divine and Catholic faith. Category 2 truths are those truths which we are to understand as to be definitively held. The first 2 truths are infallible, and the assent is supernatural faith. The Category 3, you know, would be non-definitive teachings, but still they're considered truths on doctrine or morals. They're simply presented in a non-definitive way, but they still pertain to the deposit of faith in some way, either to explain the deposit, to protect it, to point out errors against it, and so forth. And so the point I want to make is that not everything that's non-definitive falls into Category 3. Category 3 is not a catch-all, right? It has to be a doctrine or teaching on faith or morals. And so it's not prudential decisions, you know, for example, on ecumenism or prayer meetings or popes entering mosques or any of that nonsense that I would object to. So it's not that. It's not disciplines. It's not whether we assent to, you know, the blessing of sodomites or allowing women to serve the altar or do readings. It's not that. It's not even necessarily statements of fact, right? Like the Church describing what false religions purport to do, like the worship of the true God, whether they worship the true God or not. Rather, it has to be presented, you know, as a doctrinal teaching on faith or morals, even though it's non-definitive. And then only then, you know, is it require religious assent of intellect and will, which we said was human faith. And so, you know, when we look about at a lot of the stuff that's happened, you know, in the last year since the council, I mean, look at some of Pope Francis's teaching. You know, when he speaks of green energy and air conditioners, that's not doctrinal teaching on faith or morals. So that doesn't require religious assent, even though he's speaking, and you mentioned, Rob, he's speaking as a private person, and it's using his magisterium. If it's not on faith or morals, it doesn't rise to that level.
Whether magisterial doctrine.
Yeah, I mean,
in the AES doesn't mean that everything contained requires religious assent. Just because it's in a magisterial document, we call it today in the AES. So
correct. So you know, we shouldn't be, you know, hesitant to say his his stuff on ecology and all that doesn't rise to the level of a teaching on faith or morals. If he's going to authorize the blessing of sodomites, even as individuals, the proposition that such blessing is in conformity with Catholic teaching does not require our religious assent. I mean, I personally object to that. If a teaching contradicts what has been revealed in Scripture, like his position on the death penalty, something that's always been taught by the church, that does not require assent. I mean, Christ himself authorized the death penalty. It's right in Revelation. So I would say that category 3 is not a catch-all. If it's not definitive, and then it's automatically category 3. That's not true at all. So that's a point to make. I think you mentioned that the original understanding of category 3 truths, I use that in light of the Professio. I think these ordinary teachings of the magisterium were understood to have some kind of deference because Christ teaches us to hear the church. Mm-hmm. But I think the development of human faith, or the religious assent of intellect and will, is relatively recent. I think it did come with Franzelin when he applied it to doctrinal judgments of congregations, right? Whether it's the Index or the Holy Inquisition or something like that. It's interesting, Rob, the decrees against Galileo would require religious assent, according to, the traditional definition, right? So if one disagrees with the decrees of geocentrism, then he must conclude that the magisterium can teach error in her doctrinal judgment. So which one is it, right?
That's the key point, because if I can interject, people sometimes you hear them say a doctrine that requires religious assent, it can't change. It can't be wrong. Okay. Well, the March 5th, 1616 decree against Copernicus, indirectly against Galileo, against Copernicus, which defined, that's the word you defined. Well, it's a definition against heliocentrism. Well, I can read that here in a minute. But the theologians, even Saliveri, Bio, say that required religious assent. They said until the science progressed to show that, show the contrary. Okay, they're assuming, of course, science did progress to the contrary, but they said that required religious assent at the time. Saliveri says it, Bio says it, Journet says it.
Well, it still does today.
Because, right, I know. Who's to say? For me to believe the science has proven the contrary would require an act of faith, right? Mm-hmm. For me to believe, require an act of faith. I have to act of faith. Okay, you say science has proved. I don't know that. I have to believe someone says that. So I say those are still require the religious assent until it's proven.
Right.
Which hasn't been so far.
Otherwise, you have to conclude that the magisterium, of the 17th century, taught error on a matter of faith and morals in her doctrinal judgments.
But what's key is that the theologians do say that was an error. They say that science has now proven the contrary. Now, we say that's not true, but Bio and Saliveri and Franzelin and Journet all say that doctrinal proposition from the Holy Inquisition at the time required religious assent, but they say it doesn't require religious assent today. They say it was wrong. They might be wrong saying that. They say it was wrong. So that shows that theologians don't think these teachings are themselves irreformable. No one thinks that. Until today, when you have people saying the non-defendant teachings are irreformable, no one taught that before today. This is a complete nonsense. It's the all the manuals totally refute this. So this is just one of the errors of excess we see today, where everything the Pope says is going to be infallible. They're just setting themselves up for a fall. What happens when a Pope comes out and says something off the wall crazy, totally wrong? What are they going to do then? They're setting themselves up for a fall. Just take things as the church actually teaches. Don't go too far. You're setting yourself up for a big fall at some point. And that's why the Sedevacantists, heretics, take infallibility to extremes and say you have to accept everything because they want you to have that fall. They want you to say it's possible that a Pope had done X and he did X, therefore he's not the Pope. That's their whole reasoning. Yep. That's the method to claim a Pope. It's impossible. He's a Pope because he did this, and it's not possible for a Pope to do that. Therefore, he's not the Pope. That's their reasoning. They've been doing it for 50 years. Don't fall for the same error by going too far on infallibility or religious assent, saying that everything's got to be infallibly true if you're a religious assent. Cupid actually addresses that. He addresses the question of how can it be, how is it possible that we could be required to give religious assent to a teaching that could be wrong. And he explained, I'll read it later. He explains why it's still just for us to be required to give religious assent to teaching that could be wrong. Just as children, the Bible says children obey your parents, right?
Yeah.
Does that mean that everything a parent says necessarily has to be good and good? No.
Right.
A parent can command something bad, the children wouldn't obey. So the corollary to the obligation of giving religious assent on human faith, the corollary is not, as these people who err to the right say today, it's not that the teaching itself has to be infallibly true. You have to use common sense.
Yeah.
Parents children obey your parents, says the Bible. Well, what if the parents will command the child to do something erroneous, false, evil?
Right.
The child is hard to obey? No. So anyway, all right. Talking off.
Yeah, I think it's important to also note, first we talk about Franzlin's addressing and explaining this category of non-definitive truths. He's applying it to doctrinal judgments of congregations, which we've established, which took a long time before the congregation ultimately, would issue the decree. And then we have Pius XII, right, in Humani Generis, where he extends this type of religious assent to doctrinal judgments made in encyclicals. Not everything in an encyclical, right? Not the green energy stuff, but only doctrinal judgments, that is, judgments that pertain to faith or morals. Again, underlining the fact that not everything that is non-definitive falls into this category 3 proposition.
So just to clarify, what Pius XII, because this is always quoted, what Pius XII says in Humani Generis number 20 is that you can't just disregard what's contained in encyclicals. He says, nor must it be thought that what is expounded in encyclical letters does not of itself demand consent, since the Pope is not exercising his supreme authority in definitive way. But then he explains why. He says the reason is that because, first of all, most of what's contained in encyclicals already requires consent. It's already Catholic teaching. So it requires consent for that reason. But then he says, also, if the Supreme Pontiff in their official documents purposely passes judgment on a matter up to that time under dispute, it's obvious that's the mind of the Pope, and you have to consent to it. He doesn't say everything in encyclical. If the Pope is giving his judgment on a doctrinal matter that was disputed up to that point, you have to consent to it. That's basic Catholic. Bellarmine even said that, even it's non-infallible. So it's not that everything in a magisterial doctrine or encyclicals necessarily requires assent. Most of it does because it's already Catholic teaching. If Pope gives his judgment on a doctrine under dispute previously, then you have to assent to it. That's nothing. That's basic Catholic doctrine.
Yeah. Good. Do you want to turn to the OUM now?
I would also note that regarding the nature of definitive teachings versus non-definitive, Cardinal Journet, he has a great explanation in the book, The Church of the Word Incarnate, beginning on around page 340 or 330, somewhere around there. Great explanation of this. He makes a distinction between the declaratory power and the canonical power. Okay. The declaratory power is limited to definitive and fallible teachings. Those come from the declarative power of the church. Everything else, doctrinal teachings, come from the canonical power. The canonical power, he says, when the church proposes these teachings, it's not proposing them as true or false. It's proposing them as being safe or non-safe, or prudent or non-prudent to believe. Right. So he says that he didn't make further distinction, which Journet, which Franzlin doesn't. He says that on the canonical teachings, non-definitive teachings, if they're consistent with what the church has always taught constantly and universally, in that case, they'll be infallibly safe. If they're not consistent with that, with what church always taught, then the church, he says, could be deceived. They're not infallibly safe.
Makes sense.
A novelty out of the blue is not necessarily infallibly safe. I accept that teaching of Journet. It's always been taught. Sure, it's going to be infallibly safe. If it's something new, like the death penalty is forbidden because of human dignity, I don't think so. You better explain further that teaching. Church has always supported the death penalty. If you're going to say it's forbidden now because of human dignity, I need a better explanation. Not only that, but in the 92 Catechism, it taught that. It taught that. John Paul II. Then it took it out. Why did it take it out?
Right.
Why was it teaching in there and then took it out 2 years later? You can't require assent for teaching like that that's been in and out. Now it's like you're always sure. No.
The practical application of whether retributive justice should be applied is not a question of human dignity. It's a question of whether we can detain and rehabilitate, these criminals as opposed to execute them. Right. So to me, honestly, Rob, that appears to be an error. It could be an error in the catechism, but that doesn't disturb me because I understand this isn't an act of the Pope defining. It's not protected by the charism.
Now, the one way in which it could be correct to say that in the present circumstances, it's not permitted. We can't support it.
Well, I've argued that too. I've said that the fundamental principle you could say has not changed at all, and the catechism is not changing the fundamental principle that the church recognizes the state's prerogative to execute murderers. Okay, that's not changed. You could argue that's not changed in the catechism. What's changed is whether that should be practically carried out. And in other words, this is a prudential judgment. It's inadmissible today. Why? Not because the dogma of retributive justice is no longer in existence. The church can't overturn that. That's part of revealed truth. That's part of the constant teaching of the church. No, rather, it's a prudential decision by the Pope thinking that we have other means to detain and rehabilitate. So you could make that argument to say the catechism is not an error.
And the point I was going to make is that if it was the case that there's a real problem with innocent people being put to death, then you could argue against the death penalty totally, because people put to death who are innocent. Therefore, in these circumstances, we're going to have banned altogether. That can be justified. That can be justified in the current circumstance if that were the case.
That's not what the catechism says, though.
Right. Human dignity. Well, human dignity, because it's being, it would need to really clarify that point.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I'm Pope-splaining here, Pope-splaining. Like Bellarmine. Yeah, but I'm not going as far as Bellarmine did. I wouldn't say that, it's just you can marry a second wife because, say Abraham did, right?
Nonsense.
Yeah. So anyway, but again, Catholics are Pope-splainers. If you're not a Pope-splainer, you're not a Catholic. You're not a traditional Catholic. They've always Pope-splained, but don't go too far in it. Go ahead and admit when the Pope's there. That's the best thing.
I think so.
Yeah. So, all right. So, Journet. Yeah. Journet talks about, So non-definitive teachings are not taught, he says. He says this, Chupin says this, and Bio says this. They're not taught as actually being true or false. They're really taught as being safe to believe, not safe to believe. That's a key. That's the nature of the teaching. It's safe to believe this, is not safe to believe this. So when Franklin taught infallible safe, he just means it's infallibly safe to believe or not safe to believe. Right. That's all he was saying there. Anything else that Journet says about that? Well, he does say that the decree on Galileo required the March 5th, 1616 decree, which everyone can look up, required religious assent. So did Bio, required religious assent until they said the science showed that it's incorrect. Then it didn't require religious assent. So they're admitting, let me actually pull something up real quick from Bio, because he says he contradicts what everyone's claiming today, or somebody claiming today, that these teachings can't be wrong. He explicitly says the contrary. Let me pull that up here real quick. Let's see. All right. So here's what Cardinal Bio says about these non-definitive teachings that are proposed as being safe or not safe. He admits here that they can be in error and oftentimes are in error. He says this, but in speaking rigorously, that which is not safe, particularly in this composite sense of the decision, is able afterwards to become safe if perchance the competent authority should promulgate another decision, the matter having been discussed again and new reasons having been weighed carefully. For that this is able to happen absolutely, that another decision might be given, striking down a prior one is per se manifest. Indeed, it is of the nature of the decision which now comes to consideration that they are not definitive or irreformable. And then he discusses one of those, dropping down. These things are able to be confirmed from the things which happened in the case of Galileo with respect to the decrees of the Sacred Congregation of the Index, in which the opinion of Copernicus concerning the diurnal and annual motion of the earth was declared contrary to sacred scripture. In this matter, therefore, I say that there is an example of an opinion which was not safe, and now is, because there are now those weighty reasons for the motion of the earth, which then were not present. Salivary says the same thing, but he explicitly says, Salivary does, that now no longer does. But there are
one of the problems with that, number one, the science doesn't bear that out, but number two, the church hasn't reversed those condemnations.
That's the thing.
That's the problem. So that's a total argument from nothing.
Right. That's a great point, because Chupin says the same thing. You're required to believe those decrees unless the church issues an equivalent decree saying this. It hasn't happened yet.
It hasn't.
So yeah,
it hasn't. And we can refer. I did a conference on this recently, and I think you posted. Yeah. I have a brief discussion. I get into the detail of this, exactly how the decisions were made and what level of authority they are. But that is the conclusion. These remain Category 3 truths at a minimum. I mean, I also present the arguments of some in favor of infallibility. I'm not quite there, but at a minimum, these are propositions that I think remain in the third category and require religious submission of intellect and will.
These were decrees of the Holy Office approved in common form by the Pope.
Right.
Such decrees require the religious assent as Pius XII teaches, Pius IX teaches. So, unless there's an equivalent decree of the same authority contradicting it, those require religious assent. As all the theologians teach, yet they contradict.
I know. And you know what's interesting? The Pope splainers who don't ever want to admit that the church was wrong, those are the guys that reject the teachings of geocentrism, but now are forced to admit that the church can err on matters of faith and morals. Think about that. It's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah. All right. Well,
anyway,
we've gone pretty long, so a minute, 20 seconds or so. So maybe we'll do Ordinary Universal Magisterium in another episode, because there's a lot we can go into there, showing how the Sedevacantist heretics have misunderstood that teaching for the last 50 years, beginning with Father Noel Barbara, one of the first heretics, John Daly, Father Cicada, all of them today misunderstand that teaching and apply it to Vatican II and to non-definitive teachings of the Pope. They completely pervert this. These are two entirely different ways the church teaches infallibly. When a Pope or a council teaches infallibly, it's negative infallibility, prevents possibility of error.
Right.
When the OUM teaches infallibly, it's positive infallibility, which we'll get into on our next show. But these Sedevacantist heretics conflate all this, confuse everything, as they always do. You know what? There's actually one more thing we should probably mention before we conclude this.
Yeah.
And that is a erroneous teaching of Cardinal Bio that was adopted by Father Fenton, and which the Sedevacantist, of course, promote, spread everywhere. It's this: Cardinal Bio, unfortunately, taught that not only are definitions of the Pope infallible, but even when the Pope in encyclicals explains the faith, he's infallible. Now, Cardinal Bio taught that in his manual published in 1898. Father Chupin, in his book on the value of the decrees of the Holy See, gave a beautiful explanation of papal infallibility, published in 1807. When that book was published, the editor of the French publication, The Friend of the Clergy, wrote against Father Chupin and tried to refute Father Chupin's claim that infallibility only extends to the ex-Catholic definitions by quoting Bio. Okay, so the editor quoted Bio to refute Father Chupin. Father Chupin, in his revised version, or in another article, which included his revised version, refuted that claim by quoting the Relatio of Bishop Gasser. He totally refuted Cardinal Bio. And the editor of The Friend of the Clergy, when he read it, admitted, whoa, I was wrong. Chupin's right. Cardinal Bio, here's Chupin's article. I'm leaving it to you. He made the article for Father Bio. Cardinal Bio didn't come out. Nothing. He remained silent. One thing Father Chupin said, look, the only one who taught this is Cardinal Bio.
Yeah.
He's wrong. But the council nowhere teaches it.
Right.
Nowhere in the Acts of the Councils say encyclicals are infallible. This is novel teaching of Cardinal Beo. Okay. Now, Father Fenton, unfortunately, adopted that error of Cardinal Beo, wrote an article about it, and the Sedevacantists, who are always looking
for glommed down to that. Yeah.
Spread that article, Fenton, everyone claimed that it's basically teaching the church. No, that is basically an error of Cardinal Beo. He came up with an idea that encyclicals are infallible, wrote it in his manual. Let me go into something a little else that relates to that, is that in the lead up, this is an important point. In the lead up to Vatican I, there were debates over papal infallibility in numerous publications, such as the Dublin Review. The problem is that the defenders of papal infallibility were actually defending an extreme version that Vatican I did not adopt. So they were defending an extreme version of papal infallibility that the historians knew was false. So naturally that caused a reaction, right? The historians knew that can't be true. So you had two sides. You had the defenders of papal infallibility who actually weren't defending what Vatican I had defined. Then you had those opposing them. They were opposing what they were defending. So that resulted in two schools, the defenders of papal infallibility and the ones who oppose it. Cardinal Newman, may have heard, he was against the definition of papal infallibility, mainly because how it was being described by those who were defending it during that debate. When he heard that the doctrine had been defined, when Newman heard it had been defined, he fell into despair. And that despair lasted until Newman read the actual definition. He said, that's what I had always thought it was. He thought it was always that. They were defending extreme version. The reason I mention this is that, so you had the defenders of papal infallibility defending extreme version and those who oppose it. Those who oppose it became the old Catholics. So it looks like the defenders they won, right? They won. They were right. They weren't right. They were defending an extreme version of it. They weren't right either. They were also wrong. Not everyone, but just the public defenders of it. So I think that Cardinal Beo, he was influenced by them. He was influenced because not only were they defending that extreme version before Vatican I defined it, they kept defending that extreme version after Vatican I defined it, even though Vatican I didn't support what they were defending. So that's why I think Cardinal Beo taught what he did. He was influenced by those who were defending an extreme version of papal infallibility. So he taught that error that he taught in his catechism. But of course, the Sedevacantists, heretics, are looking for any extreme version they can promote because they want to prove the Pope's not the Pope. So they take whatever extreme version, even though every other manual they read teaches the contrary. It's only Catholic definitions that are infallible. I want to make that point also.
Yeah, very good.
All right.
There are other reservations about Cardinal Newman and departing from the consensus of the fathers, patristics, and medials and things, but we don't need to get into that right now. But it just shows you there's a lot of opinions out there, and nobody's infallible but the Pope, and only when the Pope's defining doctrine, right?
Yep. All right, so we'll do Universal Magisterium next. That'll be an interesting show as well, because again, Sedevacantists, heretics have been misrepresenting that teaching for the last 50 years. John Daly.
All the public non-Catholics, and I throw the Orthodox schismatics into that too. They use the same tactic by saying papal infallibility is bogus, right? Because the OUM has contradicted the OUM or the ex-cathedra decrees. They don't know what the OUM even is.
Yeah. Neither do the Sedevacantists.
Yep. Very good.
All right. So we'll end here, and then we'll hopefully post the next one sometime next week.
Until next time. Thanks, Rob.
All right. Thanks.